everyone. Welcome back and thank you for joining me again today. I had a pretty great opportunity this week. I happened to find it just by complete chance. But there was a really great webinar that the ACA, the American Counseling Association, hosted this week called Counselor Self-Care Now More Than Ever. And the four presenters were the authors of the book Counselor Self-Care, and that includes Dr. Gerald Corey. And that may be a name that many of you are familiar with. He's written numerous books, a lot of which are used in classes throughout your graduate program. And he's talked about pretty widely about as far as like different counseling theory is concerned. But this webinar really kind of focused on helping individuals kind of link the understanding of why self-care is important and for your competence as a professional within this field, and also kind of talking about how there are different maybe self-care strategies for different stages within their career as well, including looking at those that are currently in graduate school and how that adds a little additional barrier towards maybe self-care. And lastly, kind of understanding the importance of having an effective plan for enhancing their self-care and really being able to look at any kind of things that people can start doing immediately and be consistent with as far as their self-care. Dr. Corey mentioned in this webinar that he genuinely feels that self-care for those of us within the counseling and mental health profession should be a mandate. That this isn't something that we just kind of consider doing, but we should do it. And it's just as important to be doing as anything else that we are required to do within our field. And to be honest with you, I found the webinar really insightful. I went out and bought the book immediately. It's in its second edition, so I'm really looking forward to being able to kind of sit down and read that. I got it on my Kindle, so I don't even have to wait for it to be coming in. I got the electronic version of it. But listening to this webinar and really kind of having the opportunity to sit down afterwards and let it all soak in. One of the things that kind of came out about this again was the importance of what are we doing every single day? And how is the self-care that we're doing helping us be better at our jobs and also keeping us from falling into the pitfalls that can come along with that job? One of the concepts that came up within this webinar is one of the things that I definitely wanted to make sure that we covered within this podcast. And I mentioned it early on when we talked about the very specific things that we've been looking at, and that is countertransference. Now, to some, it may seem a little odd about how we can connect self-care to countertransference, but self-care is a really effective tool towards managing the issues of countertransference as they come up. But before we kind of dig into countertransference itself, let's go back and kind of review the definitions of both transference and countertransference. And I think it's important that we also kind of look at transference because they can be linked oftentimes in the development of countertransference. So, transference is defined as the unconscious projection of feelings about another person onto a therapist or mental health worker. Whereas countertransference is similar, but it more relates to the personal reactions and responses of the therapist, mental health worker towards the client. And both of these, if left unchecked, can create really unhealthy therapeutic relationships and impair the future progress of our clients. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're always a bad thing. Oftentimes when we talk about this, people get this massive red flag floating around. And yes, it can become a red flag. It can become something pretty dangerous to the therapeutic relationship. But if caught and dealt with appropriately and talked about within supervision, it can actually be helpful within the therapeutic relationship. In fact, those who still follow more of the psychoanalytical or the psychodynamic side, transference is a huge piece of the engagement within the therapeutic process. Now, transference can come about in multiple ways. A client may look at their provider and see them as a paternal figure or a maternal figure. And that paternal figure is someone maybe that they see as being powerful or wise or authoritative, protecting. Unless they have a really negative relationship with the paternal figures in their life. And then if they view this provider as a paternal figure, it could be kind of more an antagonistic interaction within there, or a fearful reaction within that as well. So also looking at that as the maternal transference, associating with the therapist or the provider with a mother figure that they may see as loving and influential or nurturing or comforting, or again, the opposite of that, depending on their relationship with their own mother. It could be a sibling transference. It could be some sort of non-familial transference, like a teacher or a coach, a coworker, a friend, someone else that they have kind of had experience with. They may just see you as another therapist that they dealt with in their past. But there can also be, and this is the big red flag one, the sexualized transference, where the person engaging in, the mental health services or in the therapy has a sexual attraction to their worker. And it may have some sort of erotic beliefs or transference that's kind of occurring whenever they're engaging with them. And it can kind of be all consuming and really be, again, detrimental to that therapeutic alliance and the client's progress. Now, countertransference, when we talk about this again, is the therapist projecting kind of their own feelings towards a client. And this could be something where they're even responding to the transference that the client is kind of projecting onto them. If the client starts to see them as a maternal figure and they're acting a certain way, that therapist or that mental health worker may kind of take on that role. And again, if it's not done appropriately, and if it's not done within the appropriate therapeutic alliance, it could be damaging. Countertransference could also be, where you become maybe overly entangled with the client themselves. You may have more of an emotional attachment to them, or you may kind of be drawn in. And there are those clients that really just kind of draw you in. They're those clients that we are really kind of more empathetic towards, that just really pull at your heartstrings. And that's normal and it's natural. And I mean, we're empathetic in nature. We wouldn't be in this field if we weren't. We're caretakers by nature. So we're going to have some of that pull towards some of our members. I mean, I can tell you, working with kids, there have been kids over the years, especially those that are in foster care, are not in the greatest situation, where I'm like, let me just adopt them. I'll take them home and they'll be saved. And I'm like, knock it off. Just stop it. And working my way through that too. But, we can also really look at it as our countertransference could also be negative. We may have some viewpoints towards that client that where we see them in a really negative light. And then that could be coming out in our interactions with them. And again, damaging of the therapeutic relationship. So one important thing also to look at in regards to transfers is sometimes it occurs because people come into services with this misconception of what therapy, mental health services really are about. And a lot of this can be portrayed by what they see in the media. And I will say that the media doesn't have the greatest portrayals of people within the mental health system or the workers, especially with therapists, and even or psychiatric providers and psychologists. And I'll kind of just talk about it. I'm a really avid reader, and I love things that have a lot of like real drama and psychological thrillers and things like that. I read kind of all kinds of genres, but inevitably something that I pick up, there's I mean, like 50% of the time I end up with something that I'm reading that there's a therapeutic relationship in the novel. And some of those I sit there and I read them and I'm like, what the, I can't believe this is crazy. And I'm just going on. And I get so frustrated with the therapist in the book, and just kind of the mental health services that are portrayed in the book too. Because again, it may start out pretty well, but then inevitably there's some kind of transference issue going on and they fall in love with their client, or the client falls in love with them, or, just crazy stuff that you think, oh my God, that could never happen in real life. But it does. In fact, one of actually the most common ethical violation within the mental health field is establishing a sexual relationship with their client. And we would think that as much training and all that we get around professional ethics and healthy boundaries, that wouldn't happen, but it does. And it's not to say that some of it doesn't occur, because people are in this field who are not very ethical. And there are people who have pretty poor boundaries that are in this field. There are a lot of people who come into this field to fix themselves. And so then that is kind of dumped on the clients that they're dealing with. But a lot of those inappropriate relationships that are developed between a mental health worker and a client is because of that transference and countertransference that isn't resolved, that isn't dealt with appropriately. When we are not able to have that healthy boundary and be able to rely on our ethical guidelines to be able to go, I am the provider, this is the client. I am not their friend. I'm not their parent. I'm not their lover. I am the therapist, or I am whatever it is that your role is. We run the risk of engaging in some pretty serious things that can cause, again, can't say it enough, damage to the client and damage to us as far as professionals, and especially within our careers. As I already mentioned, transference and countertransference is not necessarily something bad as it's happening within the therapeutic process. But the key to ensuring that it doesn't become something negative and it doesn't become damaging to the therapeutic relationship and the progress that the client is making sure that we are aware of when it's happening. So there are 4 things that we can be looking for to see if we are experiencing any form of transfers or countertransference as we're working with our members. The first one is the member engaging with any kind of unnecessarily strong or inappropriate emotions for the topic or the discussion at hand. This could be where they lash out with anger or distress that seems excessive for the situation or the topic, or maybe inappropriate laughter surrounding issues that aren't funny. And these are things that maybe need to be explored and to kind of really get to the core issues of why these emotions are becoming so big and so grandiose. When these emotions then are directed at the therapist directly, this is an obvious sign that the client is having some issues with transference in regards to their mental health worker. So, for example, if a client cries and accuses the therapist of hurting their feelings for asking a probing question, it may be a sign that someone in their life has hurt them doing something similar. And it could be maybe a sign that a parent asked a similar question in the past and they're just not dealing with it well, and they're seeing maybe their therapist as being that parent figure. So, again, something that needs to be explored and delved into within the therapeutic relationship. When it comes to countertransference, therapists or all mental health workers really need to be aware if they are experiencing any unreasonable dislike for the client. This could be even when just projecting feelings on the client too. But when we are disliking the client for no apparent or obvious reason, there is more than likely some sort of countertransference occurring. This is a really good opportunity then for workers within the field to examine their personal beliefs, their values, and their emotions surrounding these characteristics within the client that are kind of triggering to them, and really looking at their own past relationships. In fact, in going back to the webinar, this is one of the things that was brought up in the discussion as to why one of the things that we can do as workers within this field is seek our own therapy when necessary. And when we're noticing trends in our behaviors towards our clients or even towards our coworkers that may be kind of indicative of the stuff that we're dealing with, kind of bleeding into our professional life, and then getting the help that we need to manage that stuff. The fourth one to really look at is becoming overly emotional or preoccupied with a client. And so, what this really looks at is when you notice that your thoughts and feelings for clients are taking up a really significant amount of time above and beyond of when you are just with them, and not just during your workday, but outside of your workday. It's natural for us to kind of think of our clients as our day kind of goes on, especially if they're on our list for that day. There may be clients that we deal with that have similar issues, and we're like, oh, that reminds me of something I talked about with so and so just the other day. Those are kind of normal things and not necessarily a sign of countertransference. But when they are joined with really strong emotions or even become intrusive or obsessive thoughts, we may have to kind of consider referring them to another practitioner Or again, just making sure that we are spending time talking to our supervisors about it and dealing with it before it becomes a problem. So, as I just mentioned, we are human. We have our own stuff. And when we are dealing with our stuff and we are not taking care of it in a healthy way, it could in fact bleed into our work. Now, that is not the only reason why countertransference exists, but it is something that we do need to make sure that we are dealing with. And that's how self care is really important in kind of managing issues of countertransference if and when they occur. And actually, no, let me take that back, when they occur, because every single one of us is going to be dealing with issues of countertransference. May not be all the time, may only happen maybe once or twice within your professional career, but it's going to happen. And anyone who tells you that it doesn't is lying to you. We are all going to experience it because we are human and we have our own stuff. And we cannot always completely separate ourselves professional and personal. So self-care during the day helps us do that, helps us take care of ourselves. So when we're catching our stuff coming into our day, we can manage it better. But just talking about the stressors of the job, there are some different ways that we can manage this as well so that it doesn't kind of bleed into a more significant issues in regards to managing a client's transference towards us or our own countertransference towards them. And this is not an exhaustive list. It's just kind of really, it's actually kind of a repeat of some of the things that we talked about in the earlier podcast of just the basic things that we need to do to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves at work. So not necessarily the idea of just self-care, but being aware and being in tuned with ourselves, making sure that we're taking the opportunity for self-compassion and really focusing again on maintaining our balance throughout our workday, like we've already discussed in previous podcasts. So the first one kind of within this list about managing it talks about what we've already discussed is support. Whether this is peer support, whether it's through supervision, whether it's even through additional professional development, consulting with a colleague, a supervisor, a director, whoever within your field, when you're feeling an emotional trigger or response to something that is going on with a member. Especially when you're engaging in some sort of interaction that is really challenging, because it can cause us to just sacrifice our empathy and our objectivity within the situation because we're struggling just kind of managing that situation. So regular peer support, clinical therapy meetings, clinical supervision meetings can be helpful. Again, having our own therapy sometimes is necessary within this too. Another aspect that we have to look at is continual self-reflection. And we've talked about this as well, is just taking that time to really be attuned within ourselves. So exploring our feelings and our reactions towards clients, writing down ways that we are consciously or unconsciously reacting to them. There have been a couple of some of the mindfulness exercises that we've done about, walking to the waiting room, and getting prepared for your session and recognizing how you may be feeling in that, taking that opportunity to reflect after a session with someone and be attuned to how you're feeling and be mindful about that, and taking the opportunity to be mindful in the session and reflect within the session too. How are you responding to the different things? Clear boundaries. Set appropriate boundaries. I cannot say this enough regarding scheduling, regarding when a client can contact you. Having appropriate boundaries of your workday ending when your workday ends, not bringing work home with you, whether it's physically taking work home with you or emotionally taking work home with you or mentally taking work home with you. Your workday ends when your workday ends. But also boundaries about what is acceptable behavior with a client when they are working with you. And discuss any misunderstandings of intent or emotional projection as soon as it occurs. As I mentioned earlier in this, sometimes when people first start in services, they have a misunderstanding of what therapy, what mental health services actually look like. So they may be kind of engaging in some behaviors just because they don't know any better. So having that clear-cut boundary, having that good discussion with this is what our services are, and this is what your expectations are. This is what your rights and responsibilities as a member are, and this is what our rights and responsibilities as a provider are to you, and making sure that they understand that from the get-go. If they don't, we may have to repeat it multiple times. And we need to do this not only when we get someone brand new to us the first time that they're in services, but when people are transferred to us later, because maybe the person who had them before didn't go over that. And sometimes the issues that we're dealing with transference with our members can be because of poor boundaries from someone who worked with them beforehand. And they expect a lot of those same poor boundaries with us. Mindfulness again. So all these different activities that we're kind of talking about within our different episodes, practicing mindfulness inside and outside of sessions to explore your thoughts, your feelings, being able to gain some additional insight into that fatigue or that burnout or that stress that you're feeling when you are maybe noticing signs of vicarious trauma, that you're taking on the trauma of the clients that you're working with, or when you're feeling like you're not as effective in doing the quality clinical work that you have done in the past, or maybe kind of dealing with a little bit of that um, imposter syndrome, and being able to explore that and using mindfulness techniques to be able to help with that. And also observing the space between when something happens and your response towards that, so that you can make really appropriate, thoughtful reactions. So again, not just kind of jumping in and be reactive to something, but be proactive to it. And mindfulness really helps us to be able to do that. The last one to consider is just empathy. And this is more of an understanding that empathy can be, or lack of empathy, can be a precursor to countertransference. And the reason why this is, as we're experiencing burnout, if we're not taking care of ourselves and we're struggling, or maybe we have some of these already kind of emotions in regards to our members, or it's a really stressful situation, and we're feeling that burnout, that vicarious trauma, again, some of the symptoms of that is depersonalization, where we start to disconnect from our clients, where we start to disengage from them, where we have maybe more negative views of them just because we are not feeling well, we're not handling kind of situations better because we haven't been taking good care of ourselves. So our empathy is one of the first things to kind of go with that when we are hurting within our field. So taking the time to recognize when you are losing that empathy, or recognizing when maybe you are less empathetic towards a particular member over someone else, and why that is. When we employ empathy as practitioners, we're looking at the situation and client outside of our own view. And by doing that, we're making countertransference less likely. So before we wrap up today, let's take a look at 3 specific activities that we can do to help us with countertransference. We will explore some additional ones in next week's episode that are more client specific, in dealing with those clients that maybe we are struggling with a little bit more, or those clients that maybe we're being overly empathetic towards, or clients that we really like and love. But these are just kind of all-encompassing ones that we'll take a look at today. And the first one has to do with self-disclosure. And this isn't something that I talked about earlier, but one of the clear signs that we may be experiencing some countertransference is overly disclosing personal information with our members. Now, that's not to say that some self-disclosure isn't helpful within the therapeutic relationship, but we need to really understand what is the purpose behind the disclosure. And we need to recognize the appropriate ways to disclose information versus not. So this particular activity, again, these 3 that we'll go over today come from the anti-burnout card deck, which I absolutely love. And this is called Wait Before You Self-Disclose. And WAIT is an acronym that stands for Whose Agenda Is This? So when you notice the urge to disclose a personal anecdote, a struggle, an observation or reaction, mindfully pause, breathe, and ask yourself, whose agenda is this? Wait, whose agenda is this? Whose needs will be met by your self-disclosure? If the disclosure does not clearly serve the needs of the client, then consider letting the urge to intervene pass, and keep that disclosure to yourself. So wait before you self-disclose. Again, the acronym is Whose Agenda Is This? And the next one is called thinking space. So with all the suffering we face and absorb each day, we can easily fall into the trap of emotional rigidity and reactivity. In those moments, try this practice to generate space between our thickest and stickiest thoughts about clients who present challenges. In this space is the potential for our most effective work. So take whatever you are preoccupied with regarding your work and notice it as a complete thought. Now add the following to the beginning of the thought. Right now, I notice myself having the thought that. As it becomes clear that the thought is just that, it's just a thought and not necessarily accurate or the only way of seeing things, what happens to your experience of it? Does it soften or does it firm up? Does it create a space to respond rather than react? So this is really truly kind of an acceptance and commitment thing. I notice that I'm feeling, I notice that I'm thinking. We don't have to act on whatever it is that we're thinking, and really giving ourselves the opportunity to be more capable of responding appropriately in situations rather than reacting to them. The last one is one that I really like. Because no-shows drive me crazy, especially when they're no-shows at the very beginning and the very end of the day. I'm not a morning person, so when I have that 8 a.m. appointment and then they don't show up, I'm like, man, I could have slept in. And then I especially hate the ones when you're just already kind of tired from the end of the day and you're just ready to go home, and they just don't show up to that 4:30, 5 o'clock appointment if you do work a little bit later in the day. We've all experienced just that frustration in regards to no-shows. So this no-show meditation is really helpful in that situation. And I will say we have those clients that we call the frequent flyers that are constantly no-showing. So it can really be easy to experience countertransference with those clients, because when you see them on there, like, oh, I bet you anything they're just not going to show up again today. And so we really need to kind of, again, deal with that transfer or that countertransference that we're experiencing in regards to clients who no-show, and looking at it kind of independently and rather than being kind of negative about it. All right, so the no-show meditation. We're betting you never had a client no-show, right? We've all had this happen, and instead of it being a source of frustration, which can ripple out negatively in our day and in our work, what if we turn the situation into a mindfulness bell for practice? Acknowledge the thoughts and emotional sensations arising at the possibility of the client not showing for your session. Ask yourself, can I make space for these difficult thoughts and feelings? Put full attention on any physical sensations that may accompany these feelings. Send kind wishes to these feelings and these sensations, such as may you find ease and peace. Imagine your client and send him or her a similar kind wish. Spend some time simply breathing and bringing compassion to what's arising in your body and mind. A very different way of thinking about no-shows, taking the opportunity to turn it into a mindful moment instead. All right, so thank you once again for joining me today. I hope this was an empowering discussion for you, was insightful for you to kind of take a look at how countertransference may be impacting your interactions with your members and how your self-care can help to reduce the impact of countertransference, because again, we're all going to experience it. It's just making sure that we're taking care of it appropriately. I look forward to seeing you all again next week where we'll explore a few more exercises to manage countertransference. Until then, take care, and I hope you have a great week.